Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents No Parachute, a classic account of war in the air in World War I, by Arthur Gould Lee, narrated by Chris Macdonnell. Heard the heavens fill with shouting, and there rained a ghastly dew from the nation's airy navies grappling in the central blue. Tennyson, Locksley Hall, 1842. Author's Note. The letters in this volume were written in France in 1917 when I was a pilot in No. 46 Fighter Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps. Together with my flying logbook and diary and some maps, photographs and official documents, they surprisingly survived 30 years of service life. Their travels included a trip to Istanbul in 1937, then to wartime Cairo, and 2 years later the journey back to England via the Cape. Eventually placed in storage, they were forgotten until a few years ago. Now, after half a century, I have edited them for publication. Reading through these artless sentences of long ago, so haunted with the ghosts of smiling boys cut down in their prime, I can scarcely believe that the things they recount really happened to me. I cannot recognize myself. Could I have ever taken part in those crazy dances of death 3 or 4 miles up in the sky, flying a tiny, fragile one-gun airplane, trying to kill other young men in equally flimsy craft? Could it have been me who so rashly strafed enemy trenches that I was shot down 3 times in 9 days? Surely I could never have enjoyed such luck as to escape bullets and shrapnel by a few inches on more than a score of occasions. But it all did happen, and in these letters the reader may share a young pilot's casually accepted routine of daily hazard. Yet they were not written with an eye to publication. A callow youngster's thoughts did not run in that direction. They were written by a husband of 22 to the girl he had impetuously wed in the heady atmosphere of war. They were written to satisfy first her concern, and second his urge to describe on paper the great, great adventure. They were written in the ardour and immediacy of the hour. They contain neither heroics nor fine writing. They simply record the day-to-day happenings in the air and on the ground in a fighter squadron of average renown during 8 months of 1917. Perhaps my greatest surprise on going through the letters, written almost every day, sometimes twice a day, was to wonder at the stoicism of my young wife in accepting, without flinching, my many descriptions of risky and gruesome happenings, not least of the deaths of pilots in the squadron, some of whom she knew. But she, like the wives of fighting men in every war, quickly learned to live with fear and without complaint. The letters are presented as scribbled in the field on a strange assortment of writing pads and official sheets, but because twice as much material was available as I needed to produce a book of reasonable length, ruthless cutting has been necessary. Regrettable casualties among the deletions were accounts of the work of other squadrons and of the pilots in 46 who were not in my flight. In general, therefore, the letters deal only with my own experiences. Even these I have had to compress drastically. In addition to excluding passages of a purely personal nature and pruning the duplications, irrelevancies, and commonplaces that inevitably encumber any incautiously written chronicle, I have sometimes removed whole groups of letters that merely described repetitive patrols. To set against these omissions there are some additions. The names of places and the location of units, of which censorship forbade mention in correspondence, have been inserted throughout. There are occasional extracts from a diary to which were confided both views that might have brought trouble from the censor and subjects too sinister for a young wife to read. There are also linking paragraphs and footnotes, as well as 3 appendices to amplify the text, to make a good prentice airman's ignorance of higher service affairs and to put the reader into the background of political and other contemporary events that affected the work of the RFC. I should perhaps add that the views expressed in these appendices and in some of the linking paragraphs are entirely my own, and this is particularly so in Appendix C, in which the information on which I base my opinions was obtained in part from official documents only recently made available for public examination. AGL. Foreword. The young airmen of the belligerent nations of the First World War, who rode their primitive flying machines high above the landlocked armies in France and Belgium, were unique in the history of mankind, for they were the first mortals ever to give battle in the vast spaces of the sky. Among them was an even rarer breed, unique in another degree, for they waged their conflicts in a fashion that flourished but for an hour, then was gone forever. They were the airborne warriors who engaged in single combat, like the knights of medieval chivalry, but wielding a winged machine-gun in place of lance and sword. In the early days of the war, fights between the ineffectively armed two-seaters intended only for reconnaissance were rare, incidental, and inconclusive. The success of the Fokker monoplane in preying on Allied two-seaters inspired the production by both contestants of a variety of well-armed and maneuverable single-seater scouts, as they were quaintly called. These planes soon passed from tyrannizing enemy two-seaters to fighting each other. And so began the era of combat between individual pilots in single-seater aeroplanes. Because these craft were, by later standards, so slow, so small, so responsive in control, and so tight in maneuver, a pilot could come to such close grips with an opponent that if goggles were lifted, as they often were, he might see his features, even his grimace, or when he was attacked from astern, the death jerk of his helmeted head as bullets struck between the shoulders. This was the time when air combat could indeed be tinged with something of the knightly chivalry of old, when a pilot, perhaps still in his teens, might inwardly salute his antagonist, even wave to him as they circled each other, seeking the chance to fire, and having killed could feel pity for a fellow flyer, or if he had gone down in flames, remorse for inflicting so gruesome an end. For now was a period, not to last for long, when enemies in the air could fight without mercy but without hate, could even respect and admire each other's skill and valor. Yet in spite of these attitudes, every man fought with but one purpose, to kill or be killed. For the most part, this saga of individual combat took place in 1916 and 1917, during the hottest spells of the first and only war of the Royal Flying Corps, aided by those squadrons of the Royal Naval Air Service which operated with the Corps in France and Belgium. It was a saga that was never to recur, for when, on the formation of the Royal Air Force in April 1918, the brief life of the RFC came to an end, so did the conditions that permitted the phase of the nightly duel. By this time the air was crowded with hundreds of fast and lethal fighters, which operated in large disciplined formations. In the vast dogfights that often developed, air fighting became an affair of fleeting brushes between flights of 3 or 4 planes held in tight tactical cohesion with neither chance nor mood for knightly attitudes. Effective as were these ordered mass engagements in terms of destructiveness, they seldom held the same fascination for earthbound watchers as the tourneys of the earlier combatants. To the soldiery bound to the slime and carnage of the trenches, the occupants of the glinting specks dueling high in the heavens were as beings of another world. Forgetful of their own risks and hardships, they gazed aloft, not with envy, but with a shudder at the very thought of fighting in such contraptions, and generally rated the airmen as the craziest of the brave. In the homeland, the expressions of admiration were more expansive and emotional. The winged striplings of the RFC and RNAS were of the elite. They seemed in their secret confederacy of flight to be set apart from other fighting men, indeed from all other men. "They are the knighthood of this war," declared the nation's leader, David Lloyd George. Without fear and without reproach, they recall the legendary days of chivalry not merely by the daring of their exploits, but by the nobility of their spirit. But only occasionally were these Galahads of the air, of whatever race, scions of the knightly families of Europe. They came from every social level, from the cities and the countryside, from the streets and farms and forests of lands all over the world. The bonds that gave a unity to them all were that they flew and that they were young, for to fly and fight and die in the frail cockle-shells of that day was the privilege only of audacious youth. Yet once he had taken wing in this exclusive company, any fledgling with courage, skill, and luck could quickly become a knightly figure, an ace, as the French called him, a flying star, to flash in the sky like a meteor, and if he could escape destruction, to stay there resplendent. From among a multitude of unknown airmen, drawn from all the embattled nations, there emerged a constellation of champions of glittering valour and deadly talent, who were saluted both by other flyers and by non-flyers as the paladins of the aerial war. These were the men whose names, after half a century, still echo down the years, the men who vanquished their 40 or 60 or 80 opponents and sent them tumbling to death or imprisonment. These were the men who in 1917 included such stalwarts as Ball, McCudden, Collishaw, Bishop, Little, Mannock, Fullard among the British, Nungesser, Guinmer, Funk, Coppens among their allies, and among their enemies Immelmann, Bulker, Voss, and the two Richthofens. Behind them ranged a larger but still select galaxy of lesser champions, each of whom could claim his 20 or 30 victories. But counting even these, the ranks of the paladins were thin. In the RFC they amounted to but a small proportion of the several thousand pilots and observers and gunners who also flew and fought. These men shared all the hazards of the air war. They endured the searing tensions of daily anti-aircraft fire and of almost daily combat, often in outdated aeroplanes, knowing always that each flight could be the last, that there was no escape should their plane break a wing or burst into flames, for there were then no parachutes. First among this legion of the unsung were those who fell, for every victory demanded a victim. Many, especially the half-trained novices and those condemned to fly ill-designed aircraft, were shot down within a few days of arriving at their squadrons. Others, though experienced and enjoying efficient machines, succumbed to foemen superior in skill or numbers. Many fell prey to the vagaries of chance, not least those hit by Archie, or from the ground in the highly risky game of trench strafing. Of those who survived, the majority achieved no finer laurels than the satisfaction of seeing out their spell of perilous service before their nerve cracked under the strain. Yet it was this majority, made up of ordinary young men doing their job without thought of glory, who bore the main burden of the air war, who carried out the unglamorized routine duties, the artillery observation, the reconnaissances, the photography, the bombing, and the endless protective fighter patrols. These men were not endowed with the superhuman fire of the headhunting aces. They attained not even the lowest ranks of the Galahads. Although they may have had their moments of triumph, their bouts of single combat, their gestures of chivalry, and even their occasional victories, they were flyers of no fame, whose proudest boast was to have been of the honourable company of the Royal Flying Corps. This book tells, in unpretentious words, written on the day, hot on the event, of the progress from fledgling to seasoned fighter of one of these young flyers of no fame. Part 1. The Pilot's Pool. Historical Preamble. For Britain and her allies at the beginning of 1917, the outlook on the Western Front was sombre. In this third year of the war, the battle line still stretched unbroken for 350 miles across Belgium and France, from the Channel to Switzerland. The broad shell-pitted belt of trenches and dugouts, protected by myriads of machine guns trained on dense entanglements of barbed wire, had proved a barrier too difficult to pass by either contestant. Despite the years of ruthless fighting and the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives, the line had not moved more than a few miles east or west. The last great holocaust, the Battle of the Somme in 1916, launched to lessen the pressure against the French at Verdun, had failed in its ultimate aim, although a tactically useful ridge was won at a cost of 420,000 British casualties and half as many French. And now, at the start of 1917, with 4 million Allied troops facing 2.5 million Germans, there was no other prospect than again to assail the enemy positions with mass onslaughts of infantry, to pay the price of attrition by further monstrous sacrifices in flesh and blood. The chief British campaign planned for this year was a major breakthrough in Flanders, but this had to be preceded by 2 attacks to the south, by the French on the Aisne in Champagne and by the British along the Scarpe, east of Arras. In the Battle of Arras, which began on April the 9th, an advance of 4 miles was achieved at a cost of 160,000 casualties. The battle should have ended early in May, but was prolonged for 3 weeks in order to help the French, whose Aisne offensive had been bloodily repulsed and whose troops were in a state of mutiny. The consequent weakening of French morale and manpower threw the brunt of further fighting during the year upon the British, whose response was Haig's Flanders offensive, the disastrous Third Battle of Ypres. In contrast with the war on the ground, so far producing only deadlock, with neither contestant enjoying emphatic periods of mastery, the war in the air had seen the fortunes of the opposing forces fluctuate dramatically. Here ascendancy rested on the relative technical efficiency of Allied and German aircraft, and as the production of higher performance machines passed every few months from one side to the other and back again, so did the mastery of the skies above the battlefield. The first year of the air war saw the reconnaissance and artillery aeroplanes of the RFC, as of the French and German air services, carrying out their duties without serious interference. The second phase began in the late summer of 1915, when the Germans produced the Fokker monoplane, carrying a machine gun with an interrupter gear by which it could be fired in the line of flight through the arc of the revolving propeller. With this unmatched armament, the Fokker all but cleared the skies of Allied aircraft. Not until the following spring, and later during the Battle of the Somme, did the next phase come, when the Allies regained relative freedom of the air with the British DH-2 and FE-2B and 2D, which, like the pioneer Vickers gun bus, were fighter pushers armed with a machine gun fired from a forward nacelle, and the French Baby Nieuport firing over the top wing. Towards the end of 1916, this advantage was lost to the Halberstadt and the Albatros D2, both with 2 guns firing through the propeller arc. Early in 1917, the even better Albatros D3 arrived, and this outclassed all British fighters except the Sopwith triplane, and at very high altitudes only, the Sopwith Pup. But these planes had only 1 gun. Newer, better-armed British fighters now arriving, potentially equal to the D3, such as the SE-5 and the Bristol F-2A two-seater, were at first ineffective because of technical shortcomings and tactical mishandling. Later, reinforced by the Sopwith 2-gun Camel, which was to come into service in July, they were to bring the odds level. But in the Battle of Arras, the German superiority was crushing, for although their pilots, led by the redoubtable Baron von Richthofen, faced over double their numbers, the D3s destroyed the outdated British planes with ease. Only the triplane, with its better climb and tighter turn, could match them. The British casualties in this battle were the most severe ever to be suffered by the Royal Flying Corps. Between March and May, 1,270 aeroplanes were destroyed or failed to return, and during one 5-day period in April, 75 were shot down, of whose 105 occupants, 86 were killed or missing. Not without cause did this month come to be known as Bloody April. These heavy losses, continuing into May, consumed the reserves of qualified pilots, which necessitated replacements being rushed out from England without adequate training. These novitiates could be granted no gradual introduction to air combat, but were sent straight into action, usually on obsolescent craft against experienced German pilots mounted on much superior planes, and were thus, with tragic frequency, shot down on their first patrols. That the RFC possessed numerical superiority in aircraft in France was a mockery, for this was one of the prime causes of technical inferiority. The Corps was being expanded too rapidly, without due regard to the capacity for production of an aircraft industry handicapped by sordid political and inter-service rivalries, by the sterilizing grip of the Royal Aircraft Factory, and by frequent strikes among aircraft workers. Footnote: see Appendix A. Because too many squadrons had somehow to be equipped and maintained, quantity took precedence over quality, and the Albatross pilots continued to be presented with generous offerings of hapless prey. It was at this unpromising hour that I arrived on the Western Front. I would have been there earlier, in good time for the Arras shambles, had I not been unfit for active service for some months, as the result of injuries received in a flying accident due to incompetent instruction during training. The enforced delay gave me time to become a skilled pilot. On May the 16th, I was one of a group of reinforcements sent to the Northern Pilots' Pool in France. From there the letters begin. No. 1 Aircraft Depot, Saint-Omer, British Expeditionary Force, France, Friday, May the 18th, 1917. So far so good. I'm at the pool at the depot, together with some of the fellows from Port Meadow, who also crossed the Channel on Wednesday. I just sent an I'm Here postcard from the Hotel Folkestone at Boulogne, where we were billeted, for there was nothing much to say except that the sea was rough and everybody, including me, was hopelessly sick. Not the cleverest way to celebrate the first time I've been out of England, nor for that matter my formal entry into my first war. This depot stocks both aeroplanes and pilots, and also repairs the planes, and sends them to squadrons that suffer crashes and casualties. It is an ugly, sprawling place, with scores of Besseneau canvas hangars, and workshops, and rows of Nissen huts for living quarters, among them the pilot's pool. Several of the chaps waiting to be posted are old friends from 66 Squadron at Filton and 40 Training Squadron at Port Meadow. Some of the pilots who crossed with me went on by road to No. 2 Aircraft Depot at Candace near Doullens, which supplies the southern front. This includes the Arras sector, where RFC casualties have been so heavy over the past month or so. Those kept here will go to squadrons on the northern front, where things are quieter, and so will have a chance to learn the job and not get into trouble in the first few days. Most pilots average 15 to 20 hours flying when they arrive here, with maybe 10 to 12 solo, 5 on the type they're expected to fight on. With that amount of piloting, they can't even fly, let alone fight. I find I've done more flying than any of the others with my 85 hours, 72.5 solo, 18 on pups. My Avro crash at Filton certainly did me well by keeping me in England long enough to learn to fly properly. Saturday, May the 19th. In the afternoon, the monotony of waiting around was broken by a flying job. 6 of us were detailed to ferry BE-2Es to No. 2 AD. I hadn't flown a quirk for months, and when I took off I saw in my mind's eye the nasty flat-spin crash that I perpetrated at Filton, but everything went well. There was much mist around, but I managed to find my way to Candace and land without trouble, but of the rest 2 crashed on landing. 1 crashed badly en route in a forced landing, and another, called Barlow, who lost his way and landed on what he learned was the field of the Battle of Agincourt, also crashed when he got there. The 6th is still missing. I felt rather a cad not crashing too, because everyone is glad to see death traps like quirks written off, especially new ones. The journey back in a Crossley was fun, for I bagged one of the 2 front seats, the other being taken by Captain Bonner Law, son of the politician whom I'd met before. It must have been hell for the chaps inside, for the driver went like the wind, roaring round corners on 2 wheels and swaying madly, but I enjoyed it, and I wished I'd been driving, that is, if I could drive. Strange when you consider it. I can fly an aeroplane, but I've never driven a car. As it grew dark, we saw flashes of gunfire all along to the eastwards. It was thrilling to watch. The war was coming closer. I see from yesterday's newspapers, they come only a day late, which is pretty good in wartime, that there's still no news of Albert Ball. It's now 2 weeks since he was missing, and her people here think he must be dead, probably so smashed up or burnt that he can't be identified. He was a jolly stout fellow if ever there was one. I feel very proud that I'm a Sherwood Forester like him. I've just been reading about his last fight in the RFC Weekly Communiqué, which everybody calls Comic Cuts, which gives a brief account of day-to-day work in the squadrons, made up from pilots' and observers' reports. Ball's Squadron 56 gets mentioned often. They seem to be doing quite well on the new SEs, though the chaps here say they won't be really good until they get a more powerful engine. I'm writing this in the ante-room after a late dinner, but I'll have to stop now as the crowd are having a booze-up and a whale of a racket is working up. I'll either have to join them or go to bed, and as the beds are as hard as boards, it looks like drinking. Sunday, May the 20th. I didn't feel very 98.4 this morning when I woke up. The binge went on until after midnight, though I can't think why. It was one of those full-out parties that start for no particular reason and go on until the drink runs out. We had some sing-songs. One fellow produced a baby concertina and sang things like, "When this ruddy war is over, ah, how happy we shall be," and "The green grass grew all round," and some less delicate ones, such as, "Two German officers crossed the Rhine, skiboo, skiboo, to love the women and taste the wine, skiboo, skiboo. O landlord, you've a daughter fair, with lily-white arms and golden hair. Skiboo, skiboo, skiboo-bee-boo, skidam, dam, dam." And so on, for lots of verses which became more and more blue. As for skiboo, I've no idea what it means, but it's very good for yelling out at the top of your voice when you're ginned. I went to bed with my head buzzing with all the evening's talk and songs, a mix-up of our heavy casualties and dud machines with green grass and skiboos and albatross scouts, all flashing confusedly in a dizzy alcoholic world. The hangover this morning lasted until lunchtime. In the afternoon I sat with the other chaps in the pool mess and just talked. When you're waiting day after day for the summons from the adjutant that means a posting to a squadron, there's nothing much to do except play cards or read dog-eared magazines and newspapers. But this gets boring, and so mostly we talk. About the war, of course. The air war, that is, for nobody is much interested in what happens on the ground. And these chats give you a very different line from the soothing syrup they hand out at home. Fellows come hot from the squadrons to collect new machines, and they pop into the mess for a drink and a meal and to see the chaps, and they tell us the unvarnished truth, straight from the cannon's mouth, about fellows we know, killed, wounded, or prisoners, about the several kinds of machine they have to fly which ought to be on the scrap heap, and how they've been shot down in droves by this Baron Richthofen and his squadron with their latest albatross, 25 miles an hour faster than anything we have. That's why they bagged so many of our machines during the Arash show, especially last month. Bloody April, people are calling it. We've got too many death traps in service, like the FE-8 Scouts, a whole formation of 9 shot down in one scrap in March, and the equally senile Martinside Scouts, the Moraine Parasols, and the DH-2s. The Nieuport and Sopwith two-seaters aren't much better, while not one of the whole breed of BEs has a hope in hell against the Albatross and the Halberstadt. Only the triplane and the pup can give them a beating. Perhaps things won't be so bad now that new machines are coming along, like the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?